that just didn't pass muster for one of the many reasons, but usually the reason was inability to prove or demonstrate reasonably impact.
Yeah. I guess let me jump ahead for a second, because I do have a couple more questions on these lines, but you bring up the criteria that you had. And one of the things that I was wondering, I mean, I'm just thinking about, let me explain why we care so much about this and why we want to grill you on Million Saved, is that we think, we're looking for interventions and programs that have some sort of a track record of having worked before. And that's the reason for that, is that we're trying to narrow the field of charities that we look at. And one of the things that's making us flag a charity for further investigation, and it's not the only thing, but if they are basically focused on doing something that has a track record of success. And so, I understand that Million Saved is not necessarily comprehensive. I also understand that, a lot of these programs, just because they worked in one country doesn't mean they would work anytime anyone tried to do that. And I do understand that. However, there seems to me to be a big difference between something that's worked and something that hasn't. And if we only stuck to sort of randomized controlled trials type micro-evidence criteria, I think we would be missing something. I think that I have an extra level of confidence in something that's kind of worked at the experimental level and at the kind of national level. And so, well, first off, that's the way we're using Million Saved. I mean, I would like your thoughts on that, whether you think that's appropriate or whether you think we're making some sort of mistake in thinking of it that way.
So randomized control trials were certainly not the only way in which a program got into Million Saved. There were lots of interventions that got in there without having experimental research designs attached to them.
Right. Let me just be totally clear. I mean, we separately recorded which ones are in Million Saved, and then we also did a totally separate process to find which ones had good micro evidence. So to us, the ideal is something that like vaccines. Those are a lot of vaccines have been demonstrated in a randomized controlled trial, plus they're in Million Saved. That's really good. Something that's just in one or the other, that's okay. And then something that really there's neither is one of the ones where we don't see any reason to be particularly excited about it.
So I'm sorry, what's your question?
So my question, well, first I just wanted to explain how we're using Million Saved, why it's important to us, how it fits into our process, and whether you think that's appropriate. Like and we're using it as kind of, this is our main source of info because we haven't found anything else really for things that kind of have worked at the macro level, and even if not randomized controlled trial with like reasonably strong evidence. And the reason we're using that is to flag charities that focus on things like that.
Yeah, sure. I definitely think that's appropriate, in particular because the rigor with which these cases were chosen was high. So I think it's important to distinguish between procedural efficacy and, I guess, whether something actually works or not. So, a charity could be undertaking one of these interventions but not do it very well, and that's a bad thing. Or, I guess that would be one.
I agree with you. So let me just spell it out a little bit more. I mean, what we've done is we made a list of interventions that appear in Million Saved or in our alternate lists of more micro-based evaluations, or both. And then we go through and we look for charities that either focus on programs like that or have, documentation freely posted on their website of monitoring and evaluation. And charities that meet either of those two criteria get further investigated. And that's all it means. And from there, we're really looking into whether they've got enough documentation of what they're doing to give us confidence. So we're not recommending any charity just because it's, let's say, doing family planning and there's one case of family planning working well in one country. Yeah. But that's the precise way we're doing it, is that we want a list of things that have worked before. And if we find a charity doing just those things, that gets them a flag. It gets them, then they get further investigated. They stand out from the pile. That's all. So
yeah, it seems like a very appropriate use.
Right. So one of the concerns that I have, though, with that process is that when I look at the criteria, that this study used, most of them look good to me and like criteria I would want to apply to any macro story. So certainly scale is exactly what we're looking for. We want something that's worked on a big scale. Health impact, yes, we're very into that, and we appreciate the focus on rigor in this paper, which is why we're using it. And then the ones that I am less sure we would want to narrow it down by are the ones, one of them is importance. So, what if there was a program, what if there was a successful program that wiped out a lot of lymphatic filariasis? I'm not quite sure I understand the importance criterion, but the way I'm reading it is that if the disease they attacked is not very high on the list of total burden in terms of DALYs, then it's going to get excluded. That seems like something we wouldn't want to miss. And then the other one's, duration. I mean, if a program had a huge impact in 3 years, I would still want to consider that a success. And even cost effectiveness, I think cost effectiveness is important, but I would still be interested to know stories of things that had a big success and maybe weren't quite hitting the $100 per DALY threshold. So one thing I was going to ask you is there any way we could get a list of the kind of things that met the other criteria, where there was a big scale health impact, but maybe got excluded for one of those other 3 reasons? Is that available somewhere? Is there a way we could get that? Do you know how to do that, or is that just something where we can't do that?
Gosh, because I'm not physically there, don't think I have access to the files that have lists of cases that were excluded. But I can tell you that most cases got excluded for the impact reason.
Right.
Most cases that we would have even thought to consider were important, for example.
Okay.
I think that criteria was fairly weak. I mean, we wouldn't want to, because this is a developing country context, for example, we wouldn't care necessarily about interventions that are dealing with developed world diseases.
Right, I see.
So that I would say that those are more the kinds of things that we would have excluded for that reason.
I see.
For example, there's a case on dental caries, and that may not be on the top of the list of DALYs, but dental caries, it was a very innovative program, and it worked, and people were better because of it. So I think that's an example of one where you might not think it's important, but we included it anyway.
Right.
Cost effectiveness, I'm not sure how many got excluded on the basis of that either. Things like XDR TB interventions that work may be ones that were just too costly to include. But I can't think off the top of my head of any others. I mean, this was really for, in particular, country governments that were looking to do, well, that was one of the audiences, aside from donors, country governments in developing countries, and that's important for them, while it may not be quite as important for donors who don't have voters to hold them accountable.
Right, understood.
So, yeah.
So nothing. So you're saying nothing jumps to mind as something that was basically successful, had a big impact, but got left out because of importance or cost effectiveness or duration. Because that's
nothing jumps out to me. No, and I'm sure there are those lists somewhere, but I'm not at the office anymore, so I just don't have access to them.
No problem. So maybe, do you mind if I just go through a few success stories that I've heard cited elsewhere, and maybe for each one you could just say to me one of 3 things, like never heard of that, or heard of it but couldn't, the evidence for impact wasn't there, or something else. Have heard of it.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the malaria, first off, I mean, that you told me that the recent malaria interventions, you determined by the standards of millions saved were not showing impact. Does that include, I know this is pretty recent, but does that include the Kenya program with insecticide treated nets?
I don't think that was the malaria program we were really looking at. We were looking at the Brazil malaria program, and the problems there, it was a huge, it made a huge impact, but it was, the problem there was attributing the impact to the program itself,
Yep.
and not to some other environmental factors or population factors, something else. So that's why we just excluded the Brazil malaria case. I'm not sure if the Kenya one was large enough scale. I think that there were other NETS programs that were just getting going, and we didn't include them, I think, because of scale.
Okay. One of the ones I mentioned before, and I wondered if this one had more to do with the importance criterion. You know, we've seen